Greetings, my brothers and sisters of the Discalced Carmelite Secular Order and those who are interested in membership of the Discalced Carmelite Secular Order, or just to find out what the Discalced Carmelite Secular Order of the Discalced Carmelites is. Up until this video, this is video number 28, I believe. The first 27 videos were videos that touched on, that explained some basic concepts, which I wrote in a book called Welcome to the Secular Order of the Discalced Carmelites, which was published 12 years ago. In that book, I laid down certain ground rules for identifying, discerning, and understanding the Discalced Carmelite Secular Order life. But the real meat of the matter of what is the Discalced Carmelite Secular Order is contained in their constitutions. And that's what I want to begin to explain. Just to establish the reason why I would want to do this is because the constitutions of the secular order is the fundamental legal document which identifies the charism of the secular Carmelite order today, in these days. It was approved by the Sacred Congregation in the year 2003. So it's next year will be the 20th year of the constitutions. The reason why I want to do this is because of my position, because I was the general delegate of the Sacred Order, I had a large hand in directing the writing of the constitutions. But I want to give a bit of a history first so that people understand how the church has developed its idea of the possibility that there are laypersons who are members of religious orders, they're not congregations, but religious orders, specifically the mendicant orders. So I want to explain a bit of background to understand. The original secular order, or third order, was founded by St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis of Assisi founded the Franciscan friars. At the same time, St. Dominic was founding the Dominican friars. St. Dominic in Spain, St. Francis of Assisi in Italy. And they were contemporaries. St. Francis, there was before the beginning of the 1200s, in the 1200s, before that, the idea of religious life was basically understood to be monastic, contemplative. People went to a monastery and stayed in the monastery. Anything that was done in the monastery, bring people to the monastery. So the Benedictines had been around for 600 years. 500, a little more than, a bit more than 500 years. And they had monks and nuns. The nuns basically being cloistered. But the monks were basically cloistered also, the Benedictines, even though they did a lot of work. They did the work in the monastery. People came to the monastery. They didn't go out of their cloister. They brought people to the cloister. And that was the monastic life. And the understanding of religious life, especially for women, the understanding of religious life was contemplative. But then the 1200s came along, and St. Francis of Assisi and St. Dominic had a different idea about religious life. Inspired, we understand, because of the history of the orders and the history of the church, inspired by the Holy Spirit, they had a different understanding of what religious life would be, it should be, or a different kind of religious life. not in opposition to the monastic, but different from the monastic. Not better than the monastic, just different to the monastic. Not worse than the monastic, but different to the monastic. And it was basically and fundamentally called the mendicant life. And the mendicant, that comes from the Latin verb mendigare, which means to beg, which means the mendicants went out. The monastics went in and brought in. Mendicants went out, and they went out to preach the gospel. So the idea was to bring the following of Jesus into the homes of the people that the religious were going to serve. So they didn't live in big monasteries of huge numbers of people, 200, 300, 400, 500 monks. At one time in some monasteries in Germany and in France, there were 2,000 monks in a monastery. And lots of work done in the monastery, but the idea of St. Francis and St. Ignatius was to have religious life where you had smaller communities living among the people. Bring the message to the people. Bring the gospel to the people. Now bring the gospel to the people as Dominicans, as Franciscans. But the idea was to bring the gospel. And St. Francis had the genius to understand that the way to bring even further into the lives of the people with whom he was working, his idea was to create, establish, found a secular order, a third order. The nuns were founded, the Poor Clares, Dominican cloistered nuns, and of course the Carmelite cloistered nuns. But they will come later, come 200 years later. So the Poor Clares were established, but he wanted a third order, not just of lay people, not just not just of friars, consecrated man, not just of women, nuns, but an order for lay people. They called it the order of penance. The idea was to practice the spiritual life in the home, practice the following of Jesus in the home, converting the home. So that the whole idea was to bring, the mendicant idea was to go out of the monastery, bring the message to the people in the place where they are, where they live, in their circumstances. The Carmelites, of course, were established, the friars were established around the same time as the Dominicans and the Franciscans. But because they were out of Europe, they were in Asia, in Holy Land, there wasn't the communication. Of course, this is centuries before automatic communication. We think of communication today, and we have no understanding of why it doesn't take 2 seconds to get into communication with somebody. Well, there was no communication going on until the Carmelites eventually went to Europe at the end of the 13th century. But when the Carmelites did go to Europe, they lived first with the Dominicans in France, and then moved to England and Aylesford. The general of the order who established the Carmelite nuns, John Soreth, Blessed John Soreth, was a Frenchman, and he established the Carmelite nuns in about 1275. 200 or more years after, 200 over years after the establishment of the friars. Before that, it had just been friars for 200 years, 200 more years. But then he established the nuns, and in the same decree, at the same chapter in 1475, where he established the nuns, he established he established the secular order. So the founder of the secular order for the Discalced Carmelites was Blessed John Sorth, with the same mendicant idea. Bring the spirituality of Carmel, or bring the spirituality of Francis, or bring the spirituality of Dominic. Bring the spirituality of Carmel to the houses of the people that identify with us and that we serve. So the idea was to establish some way in which lay people participated in the order, participated in the spirituality of the order, participated in the ministry of the order, participated in the sanctification of the church, of the world that the order was called to bring. And again, this is before mass communication, and so general chapters would happen. This started maybe in England, or maybe it started in France. Then again, it started again in Italy, and then again it started again in Spain and Portugal, and it started in different places at different times. And what happened was there were different rules, there were different regulations for all of these secular orders according to the country. Again, remember, there's no internet to pass messages around. There's no consultation that's done. So, over the course of the centuries, from the 15th century, 16th century, 17th, 18th century, 19th century, there developed different rules. There were 2 rules in France, there was 1 rule in England, there was 1 rule in Ireland, there was 1 rule in Germany, there was 1 rule in Italy. Different rules for the secular order. But there were also different congregations. There were 2 congregations of the Discalced Carmelite Friars. There was the Spanish congregation and the Italian congregation. And there were some differences, and there were some little things that caused the disagreement. But Pope Leo XIII, in 1875, started to work on the Franciscans and the Carmelites and the Dominicans and other mendicant orders to bring some unity, because there were divisions. But especially for us, what's interesting to us is that the Italian congregation and the Spanish congregation were brought together. But at the same time, he wanted a little more order brought into, a little more organization brought to the movements that were associated with religious orders and religious congregations. They were multiplying in our own order. Every country established a different confraternity, a different kind of confraternity. And so Pope Leo XIII wanted to reduce the multiplication of memberships. That was in 1875. Along goes history, everything moves slowly, communication is slowly. Decrees are written, and then 2 years later somebody finds out about them. There's not a lot of real. Again, we're spoiled by the communication methods we have now. But we get to 1875. Then in 1917, there's a Code of Canon Law. Now, communication begins to be more apparent, more available communication. And literacy has included, so that many people now are able to read, many more people are able to read. Between 1875 and 19. My relatives who lived in 1875 didn't read or write. But by 1917, most people read, or a lot of people could read, a lot of people could write. And in 1917, there was a Code of Canon Law, and the Code of Canon Law insisted on the organization of memberships in the different religious congregations. And there was a specific direction in the 1917 Code of Canon Law to distinguish between those people who were members of the Third Order, then called, and those who were members of confraternities. We have, in our order now, because of this decree because of the Code of Canon Law in 1917, we have a third order, second order. 1917, we had a third order, where the confraternity of the scapular and the confraternity of Saint Teresa, confraternity of the Infant of Prague. That's it. There were many, many more. So everybody had to organize themselves around. Were you a secular order member? Were you a third order member? Or were you in a confraternity? Third order had some requirements to it, had some demands to it. Secular order was the confraternity was basically to prove itself wearing the scapular and identifying our lives with the life of the order of Discalced Carmelites. Now, the product of the 1917 Code of Canon Law was a book printed in 1922 called the Manual. And the Manual was uniform for the whole Second Order throughout the world, no matter what country you were from. There was the Manual. And the Manual, 1922 Manual, was the rule for Second Order members from 1922 to 1974. There may be a few people still alive who remember the Manual. 1974 is 48 years ago. We're trying to understand. Somebody lived in the Second Order under the Manual. They are one of our most senior members of the Discalced Carmelites. But most people joined, most of us who have known the Second Order for years, beyond 2003, before 2003, knew what the Rule of Life was. The Rule of Life was written as a result of the Second Vatican Council, because the Second Vatican Council issued documents that touched on the nature of the Church and the activity of the Church in two documents that are fundamental: Lumen Gentium and Apostolicam Actuositatem. Apostolicam Actuositatem, apostolic activity, which was the document, as I pointed out before, which was the document that touched on the secular, lay persons, the activity of lay persons in the Church. So the Rule of Life was written as a result of the Second Vatican Council. We still move along. Then the Rule of Life became universal. That was the Rule of Life. That was it. That was the Rule of Life in every country, in every league, in every land. The Rule of Life became the guide for the secular order life. But then another thing happened. In 1983, there was a new Code of Canon Law. And even more critically, there was a Congress on a synod in Rome under the guidance of Pope Saint John Paul II, a synod on laypersons, which produced a document, Christi Fidelis Laici, on Christ's faithful people, on Christ's faithful lay people. And that's the synod on the laity, or the meeting of the bishops of the world who are responsible for guiding the Church, and then produced a document which John Paul II then put together and wrote and issued, made some demands on the structures of all apostolic activity of all ways in which lay people are involved in the church and in the religious orders or congregations or societies. So as a result of that, in 1986, 87, my father Camilo Maxise, who was the general of the order, had an initial congress, and I think it was in the year 1990, a congress on the seculars, for the secular order. And then that initiated a process which developed no, pardon me, it was later than that. It was not 1990. It was maybe 1985, 84, 85. A Congress on the secular order. I'm not sure the exact date. And that initiated a process which resulted in the creation, the establishment of an office and a position in the administration of the order called the Secretariat for the Secular Order, with a Delegatus Generalis, a general delegate. And I was the first person who was invited to participate and was invited to begin that secretariat. Then we had a Congress in the year 2000, and the presentation in the Congress in the year 2000 was based on what do we need to do to comply with the demands of the Code of Canon Law of 1983 and the document Christi Fidelis Laicis of Pope John Paul II. And the end result was to establish a committee. That is the big thing in the church today. We established committees, and we established a committee. The committee that wrote the Rule of Life was a committee of 6 friars, one from Germany, one from the United States of America, one from Germany, one from France, one from Italy, one from England, one from Poland, I think. I'm not sure. But it was that was the committee that was established in 1970 or 71 or 72 to come up with a new legislation for the secular order that would produce the Rule of Life. Then our committee, the committee we established at the Congress of the Secular Order that was held in San Juan de los Lagos in Mexico, the Congress was established, the committee that was established was a committee of 10 lay persons, plus myself, and then my secretary at the time, who was Irma Estrada Franco from the province of Mexico, secular order member. But there was an Italian, there was an American, Cuban American, there was a Spaniard, there was a Swiss woman, there was from Asia, there was an Indian, there was a Argentinian, there were from all over the place, from all over the world. Lay persons who came together. They came together 3 times, but we were able, of course, now to work with computers and with messages, so we worked with computers and messages. But we met 3 times in Rome. They sacrificed a lot of time and effort to discuss in 3 different times the identity and how we were going to put together a language. A lot of consultation was made with people. The first drafts of ideas, that were put out. I collected over 6,000 emails of observations on what we were doing in the process of developing a legislation for the secular order. And so we developed it over the course of 3 years, meeting 3 times, once a year for 3 years, consulting and taking into account the observations that were made. Some people's observations were very simple, maybe just 1 line or 2 lines. And some people's observations were pages of brilliant text sometimes to help us to see how do the secular order understand themselves. But again, the secular order legislation, this time, because in the Vatican, in the office of the Congregation of Religious, there is a section with a big, in Latin, a big sign above it, Ordinum Secularum. There's a section for orders, the secular orders. That was new, because new legislation now, any legislation with regards to secular, because you're part of the religious order. You're not a confraternity. You're part of the religious order. And it's the church that tells what the order is. The church tells us, friars and the nuns, and the seculars, who they are. And so our legislation is not just written by ourselves. We had to write this legislation and present it to the Sacred Congregation for approval. So it took years, the 3 years, to write the secular order constitutions. Finally, after Father Camilo Maxise gave it its final, it was his final act in his 12 years as General of the Order. His final act was to put together, rewrite, or organize what we had done in the committee, and put it together to present it to the Holy See. And although it was presented to the Holy See by the succeeding general, Father Luis Arostegui, it was Father Camilo Maxise who put it together. Father Luis Arostegui presented that document, those constitutions, to the Sacred Congregation. In the next video, we'll pick up and introduce then we'll go right into the text of the constitutions. God bless you all. Again, any questions or any observations, please feel free to make.